encouraged it though. I've been thinking about trying to whip everyone back into shape, It's like I feel like now no one shows up on time because they don't want to waste the 5 minutes, but it's just a spiral into worse and worse behavior.
Yeah, there's a, carrot and stick, right? So a little too much carrot, I think. All right.
Let's get started. Just a reminder that there is a doc attached to this meeting. Please sign in for attending. See, we have already finished our first agenda item, which is to start the YouTube live stream. And next up, new faces.
This is your moment to give us the official intro.
Good morning. Yeah, so my name's Jonathan McAllister. You can call me Johnny. And I recently joined Heroku Salesforce, managing the languages team, which is using, we have the kind of legacy Heroku build packs, and now we're migrating to the CNBs and getting to know Terrence quite a bit, who's involved with this project. And he advocated for someone from our group to participate in this. So I'm here. I am.
Welcome. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you.
I think that's pretty much it. Everyone else we already know, but I think it might be nice to just go ahead and introduce ourselves to Johnny. So I am Sam. I work at Bloomberg in the ML platform team. I'm one of the maintainers of the PAT team.
I can go next. I'm Emily. I work at VMware. I'm on the core team of the CNB project with Terrence and Joe. And this is one of the sub teams I like to be involved with.
I can go next. My name is Forrest. I work at VMware on the Paketo build packs project.
I'm Frankie, same. I work on the same team as Forrest on Paketo build packs at VMware.
Dan, I also work at VMware on Paketo build packs, primarily with Java.
And I'm David. I also work at VMware on Paketo build packs and the Java sub-team as well.
Status updates. I know Aiden isn't here today, but he asked me to pass on a few things. He's been working on one, updating our build pack authors guide to API 07, and two, in the last learning team meeting, we were discussing the lack of any Go documentation around our bindings. So I think Aiden will probably be helping out with that as well. So just to make sure that apart from Bash, we also have good documentation for the only binding we support officially, which is Go. I don't know if anyone else has any status updates they'd like to share.
I'm excited that we're doing the Go doc. I wonder if once we get it in place, we could turn on the linter that enforces it.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know, for what it's worth, being new, I don't know what is worthy of, what is share worthy and what isn't. So forgive me, but I think you guys are aware that we're kind of building a Rust implementation of libcmb, and that's going pretty well. So we're starting to roll out, at least in local prototype form, more coverage for more languages, and the project is accelerating a little bit in the next quarter. So I'll be eager to share what comes out of that. And I actually built one myself for a Swift Vapor, server-side Swift Vapor API, which was enlightening. I'm new to the whole build packs concept, really. So for what it's worth, it seemed to function as expected.
Is there a link to the work that you're doing that you could share?
Good question. Are you talking about the libcnb.rs project specifically? We do have a link to that.
Yeah, I see somebody put a link in the chat.
Is there a particular reason why Rust was the language that y'all wanted?
I'm learning about that choice, and it had to do with some, personal preferences, as I understand, as well as, cross-platform support, so support on Windows, and beyond that, I don't have a maybe more thorough answer. If you give me a few minutes here, I can maybe pull up some more detail on that and give you some more info.
Yeah, no pressure, just sort of for my own edification.
I think from my past conversations with Terrence, the main reason for using Rust was just because Rust has better compatibility for Windows than Go, especially with the way it deals with paths, file paths and stuff. And I remember Terrence shared some link on why Rust was better for Windows than Go. Yeah.
Right. Because you can run Go compiled programs on Windows, but yes, something to that effect. And I don't have the lower level details. I can find it though.
On like a different topic, this week there's like at least one, but maybe two people who pulled up to the Paketo Slack wanting to know about like creating build packs to install dependencies that they were interested in. And we directed them to the build packs.io documentation, that sort of bare bones, how to create a build pack. And they came back with the feedback that, or they left with the impression that that guide was specific to Ruby, which maybe is feedback that you've heard before, but I just want to surface like, yeah, that's something that we heard, which, for me was surprising because I already know what's going on in those docs. But yeah, I guess perhaps if you don't already know, then it seems that way. So if those docs could be improved to sort of point out like, and here's where, this would be not Ruby specific or whatever, I think that small change would provide a lot of value.
So
Really like the work you guys have done on the Paketo side to sort of break the Paketo docs into how-tos versus like reference. And I think on the build pack side, it'd be nice to have clearer categories for some of these docs. Like I think we have a tutorial that has a Ruby example, but I think that's different from a how-to. Like a set of how-tos about how to do different things in the build pack might be nice to make that distinction explicitly.
I was actually planning on talking about this in our last learning team meeting. We dedicated the entire hour to build pack authors guide and the shortcomings. Like we have a similar situation in Bloomberg. We have lots of new build pack authors, and they go back to the build packs IO docs, and they don't find much there. Like there are lots of things missing. There are also lots of concepts which are difficult to grasp from the current set of tutorials. Like there's no information on how inter-build pack communication works. Like it's just a single standalone build pack that uses its own provisions. So you never really get into the depths of how provisions and requirements and resolution of those requirements work. Like there's just a single line that magically picks out the Ruby version from, but it never really talks about how do you deal with version resolution, or like how when you have multiple requirements, how do you resolve that? None of that is mentioned anywhere, or any example of that is given. There's no documentation on setting environment variables whatsoever, which is huge, I think. So we spent most of the last, like the entire hour in the last learning team meeting figuring out how we can improve the build pack authors documentation, and like Aiden's gotten like the PRC is working on, or like slowly trying to address those. We also talked about the fact that currently there's this just one tutorial for build pack authors where like it's one long thing. It doesn't tell you how to do like very specific tasks like set environment variables, create a start script or entry point. But like you have to follow the whole thing in the context of that Ruby example to know how to do anything. And as opposed to the app developers reference, which is like it tells you how to set, like how to invoke an entry point, how to like use a project descriptor or something like that. So like breaking down the build pack authors documentation into like similar how-tos, and then having some sort of a language switcher where you can still use Bash because it's easier to understand for most people than like Go, but I think it's really hard to write production build packs in Bash. So I think the idea was to divide this out and then have like a switcher, like a tab switcher or something, where you can choose your language. So like default is Bash, just so you understand what's happening. But if you want to use libcnb, for example, you can switch over to Go. The other feedback that came up was like the current version of libcnb has some interesting interfaces that we're trying to get rid of in libcnb v2. So we also had some discussion on like when is the appropriate time to put Go documentation on the website. Is it right now? Yeah. or after we have libcnb v2. There was also
anyone wasting their time explaining layer creators on the build
Yep.
packs IO doc. Let's just get rid of them first.
We've already gotten rid of them in v2, but I think one of the things I want to talk about was like figuring out a concrete release plan for v2. I think we've been talking about it for a while, but I think we should start coming up with something concrete. We also talked about like alternative Go implementation. So like we talked about common utilities you might need, and then packet and libpack came up. I think the general decision, at least in that meeting, was like we can provide links to those libraries, but I didn't want us to explicitly document any of those things in the buildpacks.io website, like specific interfaces to packet or libpack, because if they change, then who maintains those documentation? I don't think the Piketo team will go and make sure that if packet or libpack is changing, they're also going and changing the buildpack snippets or whatever we have there. Like this came up because we have some other platforms that we document with some simple examples. But I thought the analogy didn't really make sense for something as fluid and detailed as a library, as opposed to a platform where the interface would, at least the user interface would hopefully remain the same.
I feel like if there are situations where we feel tempted to document something in like packet or libpack, that's a good signal that like maybe we should work on extending our libraries or even the spec itself. It's like, I'd love to tell people like an easy way to choose between like 3 versions of a dependency, which is sort of infrastructure we've built in Paketo. That's like, using the metadata section of BuildPack TOML and the library. But instead of documenting that, it's like, could that become a first class, concept in the project? And then like, as we make those changes, we can document them.
I think we've spoken about this in the past, like there's this tools section we have documented with like common tasks that you want to do as a BuildPack author, and which would be nice to have some reference implementation for provided by the BuildPack IO team. But like as soon as you hit that, it becomes very opinionated or very specific to the language. It can try and create some abstractions, but I wanted to, the general consensus was we'll keep libcnb clean from any opinionated tooling, utilities, and implementation, and then have a separate thing that plays well with libcnb. The other thing,
I'm not advocating that we put opinions in libcnb, just some basic stuff. Like I think we've wanted a first level concept of assets for a long time, right? Stuff like that. I think would eventually make its way into libcnb once it's made its way into the spec.
Yeah, that's the summary from the learning team meeting. It just came up because like we're trying to find appropriate training materials for BuildPack authors in Google, and there's really not any upstream. That's pretty much it for status updates.
I have some more detail on this choice if now is a good time for that. And now I lost it. Hang on. So let's see here. I can just read from this document. Why Rust not Go? Go likely the language of choice people will think of for solving portability concerns with cross-platform. However, Go's simple abstractions optimize simple overcorrectness with all OSs. Most of Go's APIs, much like Node.js's APIs, are designed for Unix-like operating systems. Example, on Windows, files don't have modes, stat, lstat, fstat, syscalls, but it's common for file APIs in Go, JavaScript, and Node to be Unix first. So I think that's just the theme was, Rust is going to provide, like a simpler experience on Windows. In Go's case, it just makes up a number when asked what the mode is on Windows. And then furthermore, TOML support, I guess, in Go wasn't, I don't know, as mature. I don't know if that's come along since this was written. But I think that first one is really the primary driver. Strong typing and just, I guess, preference. So that's kind of the logic. I don't know if there's any thoughts or opinions on it. Did Terrence talk about it with this group? And it confused me a little bit too, because I'm like, what is this? Why are we doing this? But
that explanation, it sounds more like a preference than a limitation, right? Like I think, at least on the VMware side, we definitely write Go build packs that run on Windows, but it's just about, how do you feel about the syntax and what it looks like when you're doing cross compatibility versus in Go versus Rust?
Yeah, and I can speak from my personal preference, not having written much Go and coming more from like the Ruby side, and Swift, Rust is a lot more comfortable. It's an LLVM language. So I think that's part of it. Efficiency, velocity. And then, there is one other comment in there that, I hope no one takes offense to, but maybe some ownership, like anxieties, sharing a project with a wider group, less control, more complexity when trying to solve local problems, right? So I think that probably played a factor too, for what it's worth. But hopefully we can, still achieve the same outcomes. And like I said, we're going to be hoping to publish more build packs that support migrating Heroku customers to CNBs. And we're also expanding our use of CNBs in Salesforce with a project called Functions. So that's coming online. So yeah, and as I learn more, hopefully I can articulate a little better what our needs are, if there are any.
Yeah, that's great. I think this group is very interested in all that feedback. Like whether you want to use our library or not, like, use whatever is most helpful to you. But what we really want is feedback about your experience of being an author of a cloud native build pack, so we can use that to inform priorities.
Cool.
Yes, I'm checking out the status updates. Agenda item less anyone has anything. Separately, moving on, RFCs. Can share my screen. I don't know if there's anything specific people would like to talk about. I know, Daniel, you were interested in the read-only workspace thing you were talking about. Don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I was following that thread, and I remember you had talked about it previously, but I couldn't find an RC for it. Did you submit one yet, or is that still in the works?
I did not. So
okay,
there's
sense,
one, which is this additional exportable layer. So Stephen and Terrence and I were working on this at some point, and one of the concepts here is the introduction of multiple workspaces. The idea was that there would be, so it's not fully defined here, but the idea was there could potentially be a read-only workspace where all build packs read the application source code from, and then specific workspaces that they output to. So let's say all the Java build packs want to work together and output a jar or a var somewhere that's not the application workspace, and you want to keep your config file somewhere else. You want to keep your front end compiled assets in some other workspace. So the idea was to just have multiple workspaces. This is also achievable right now, just like subdirectories and /workspace. The other benefit was that you could change the location of this output workspace from just /workspace / some subdirectory to some other path. And the build packs that want to collaborate on a common workspace can just declare that, hey, the workspace I'm interested in is the Java one. You can map the Java one to be something like /out, whatever. I'm not really familiar with Javaisms, but like whatever folder you want and put things there. Versus for like Node, if you want to store your Node modules somewhere else, like probably under dist or cache or assets or something like that, you can do that. This was like an extension of this RFC because like we were dealing with so many use cases at once. We wanted like a way to export out specific folders. We wanted a way for multiple build packs to collaborate on common workspaces. And while we were doing this, one of the ideas came up that what if the original workspace was just read-only? Because typically when a build pack detects something, it's read-only. By the time it gets to building it, if one of the previous build packs has just wiped the workspace completely, the build pack that was detected now has nothing to do. So it just fails if the user or the previous build pack didn't leave appropriate files for it. Like the typical example was if you want to build an application that has both a front end and a back end, with the back end written in something like Go or Java, they'll typically just clear out the workspace. And by the time the node build pack starts compiling things, like those files would be already gone. Then there was some other conversation around like how we can use this to deal with mono repos, which again, I understand the need, but like the scope of this RFC was getting larger and larger. So we just decided to cut it out to just this first and then introduce the read-only volume bits or read-only workspaces bit in the future.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, we certainly have some of those problems, you know, like we're very dependent on the order that build packs run in, and adding new build packs is a exercise in really making sure you understand that order, you know, to know where things get plugged in. You know, so far it's been manageable, but being able to, I guess, reduce some of that dependency on order would certainly be a win for us. I think when I was reading that thread, my concern was kind of just around trying to understand, like it seems to flip the kind of paradigm around, and like right now it's default all in, and this is kind of a default nothing in, which, you know, is fine. It's certainly a logic change for us, so I feel like it would probably be a decent bit of work, and that's why I was trying to understand too, like what some of the benefits of putting that work in would be, because, you know, if it's just a matter of flipping that around, and it's going to, for us, result in basically the same image, you know, because we are pairing out quite a bit of stuff. You know, so if we copy in or delete out, you know, it's same thing really. But it sounds like there are some potential benefits to doing that. I'm a little unclear about the multiple workspaces, how that would like does that then compress down into a single workspace in the final image, or do you then have to coordinate those?
You would definitely have to coordinate those. I think so. There've been a couple of RFCs that got pulled in. So one of those was the process specific working directory proposal. So like, since these workspaces would be different directories, if you have specific processes that work with that, like you have a worker process and like some server process, your worker process may be in some different directory and different workspace, and the build pack that created it would launch it in that workspace. For like cross build pack communication, the idea was that you give a workspace identifier and the build pack knows the location of that common workspace identifier, and they can put things in that shared workspace the way they do right now. So rather than hard coding it to like /workspace, they know the name of the common workspace they're interested in, sort of similar to the contract we have around provisions and requirements right now. It's just a string identifier, and build packs know how to communicate with each other using that string identifier. Similarly, build packs that you want to work together or share information about the workspace they're putting things in would just use that string identifier to map to a directory, and then appropriately set the process entry points or like any environment variable paths or whatever based on that.
Seems
Okay.
like build packs would have to be aware of a lot more.
Yeah.
Because right now, it's just sort of the working directories, how build packs become aware of the workspace. And then there's also a lot of conventions around like, if I create an exec-d script, it runs in the workspace. And then like, would you want different ones to run in different places? And same with the launching of the process itself.
I also wonder if it results in duplicate files. If one build pack is copying a bunch of stuff into its workspace and another is copying stuff into its workspace, if that's going to result in the same things being copied to multiple different locations. Like if they don't coordinate at a really basic level,
I mean, at least to me, the coordination aspect of it is pretty much exactly the same as the provision and requirements coordination. You can't, you have to know what provisions a specific build pack, like what the exact names and the structure for the metadata for a requirement is. And you wouldn't magically be able to just set that to anything. You have to know exactly what the other build packs in the group are doing in order to achieve communication between build packs. This is just expanding that from provisions and requirements to working directories.
It's worth noting that provision requirement stuff is a consistent source of complaints, right? I wouldn't say that those limitations on that functionality are the most universally praised and successful part of the build pack API.
I'm just saying that there's precedence.
I mean, you can have, I guess where my thought is like with Paketo, we coordinate things pretty closely because we control, we control all of our build packs. But if we pull in a third-party build pack that maybe just wants to add on some functionality at the end, let's say it needs some application files, it probably has no idea what Paketo is doing, and it's just going to copy some swath of the application into its own workspace, and that's to me where you could end up with some duplication, in that resulting image. And I only mention that because anytime we have the slightest bit of duplication, people get really upset about making their images larger than they should be, which is what it is, but maybe just something to consider.
Again, it's about the build packs you're using and whether they coordinate together, right? Like there's nothing right now in the API that says all the build packs you use in the group like work effectively with each other. The life cycle of the platform doesn't really have any guarantees to make sure that the build packs you're choosing are compatible or not. It'll just run.
Just like we're talking very abstractly about this concept, maybe you have examples, Sam, where you're already doing this by another means in your build packs. I can definitely think of like the .NET Core language family build packs in Paketo are doing a thing that's very similar to what you're describing, I think, where we have multiple build packs contributing to what we call the .NET root, which is like where sort of all the important like libraries and runtime get installed, and they all do need to be co-located as far as .NET itself is concerned. And so we do some hacky-ish things to ultimately get it to work where we're dumping stuff into a specific location inside of /workspace. And it does introduce coupling that kind of can be painful from like a developer perspective. And I don't know that this proposal would ameliorate that necessarily. Like I think it would be the same amount of like pain from coupling, but just sort of like with the coupling relocated to a different place on the file system, I guess.
So
yeah,
at least my motivation for this was like we have an ecosystem that works similarly to what you described in .NET, except we need to keep it at a specific path. Like it needs to be at a specific path that is not /workspace. And the way we get around that right now is through some hacky things with the stack and symlinks to get the workspace subdirectory to map out to that other location. And this proposal specifically was to get around those kind of issues. Like the other example we had was the AWS extensions one, where like they're going to be in somewhere like app, AWS, something, and you put the extensions there. And like if you have multiple extension providers, they might want to work within that directory, but the directory location needs to be fixed to some path like that, not /workspace. The other comment around like opt-in versus opt-out, like in terms of file copying behavior, like leaving everything from the application source code by default in the output image definitely goes against a lot of the security aspects of build packs we aim for. You're leaving source code files there, you're leaving potential secrets there, you're leaving your Git directories there with all of your past commit data, unless there's a build pack that's specifically cleaning all of those things out. It also is very much different from how build packs typically work. They detect that here's a file I'm interested in, and here's a series of steps I'll perform on the series of files I'm interested in. Now, the build pack has to be aware of not only the files it's interested in, but also potentially any other files it has to clean out. So like the current concept of detect goes better with the build pack selectively taking out pieces it's interested in from the app folder to the output directory.
I think
there are like two concepts here. There's like the multiple app directory stuff, and there's one which is like read only application source code input getting built into some output, and the build pack selectively deciding which pieces it needs to pick.
I think my comment around that, the opt-in versus opt-out, was more the fact that it's already opt-out, and at least from the Paketo standpoint, we've implemented that. And so it's kind of like the initial design put that responsibility on the build packs, and now we're talking about moving that responsibility around. And it's just extra work since we've already implemented it. You know, that's really the crux of it. It's not, I'm not trying to say one's better than the other or anything, but when it's done, it's hard to justify going back and redoing it.
I think it's the opposite. I believe like if the platform or the project should aim to be secure by default and give build packs the option to copy things in, rather than knowing about the state of the entire world and then deleting things that it's not interested in. Like that leads to some other problems that you described with like inter-build pack coordination and security in general. Like I know if as a build pack author, like operator, if I don't specifically put in a build pack that removes things, like you'll end up with larger than usual application images. And it's also opposite of the typical Docker files like concept where you choose to copy in things rather than everything in the current context directly just being in your output container image.
I mean, I think it's totally possible that you're both right and that it's the right thing to do. And it's a huge pain for people who have well-developed build pack ecosystems.
Right. Yeah, I'm not saying it's the wrong thing, just a pain.
The other argument I guess I would make in terms of I need to read the proposal about multiple arbitrary workspaces to know how this maps. But in the past, I've sort of wished we had two, an input workspace and an output workspace, mostly not for our existing workflows, but when you think about what like a develop API would look like. So if you want build packs to be able to sort of produce change sets that can be loaded, like live reloaded into a running container for some of these sort of like tilt and local dev workflows. What you really want is for build packs to be able to, look at changing inputs and then, make their modifications to the output. But if what a build pack is doing is sort of deleting all the inputs and putting in the output, then it's hard to set up a system where everything's watching and you copy in changes and copy out changes. But if the input and output were different, then you could use that to design tooling for dev workflows.
What is the default behavior of this? So like if you just didn't create multiple workspaces, would you end up with basically what you have now?
As of right now, this RFC doesn't at all deal with this problem we're discussing. Like I left that part out intentionally because the only thing I was interested in was just putting certain files in certain places. That's it.
Gotcha.
Everything else was like things we discussed. Like this was supposed to be a starting point that we could build upon to address all of these other problems. It's just that there were a lot of like use cases we tried to sort of shove into this multiple app directory proposal. Like we discussed a lot of them so that like if we introduce something like this, how could it be used in the future to enable use cases like the ones we're just talking about. But I didn't actually describe all of those in this RFC.
I
If you
worry
want
that there are a couple non-starters that we should probably talk about before we develop this too far, which is number one, is this implicitly assuming that all build packs will upgrade their build pack API at the same time? Like, is there any world in which you can upgrade one at a time in this workspace situation? Because if not, that might just be a hard blocker. And then number two, I know like even in the build pack MVAR discussion, I was down for sort of removing these positional arguments as we introduce NVARs. Like, yes, it's a little painful for build pack authors, but we need to do something. You can never delete old stuff unless we're prodding people forward. You know, there's trade-offs there. But it seems like that's like in the view of the project as a whole, like a not okay type of breaking change. And like I accept that, hearing the counter arguments. And if that is like a not okay type of breaking change, I see that as like pretty trivial, especially if you're sharing a library to move from, you know, reading the second argument to reading a specific environment variable. So then like if we're, you know, going from by default in to by default out, like that's a much bigger change that we'd be forcing on every build pack in the ecosystem.
So that's why I didn't include all of this in the current RFC, but exactly because of those issues. Like how do we preserve backwards compatibility where current build packs just assume everything left there will be copied out. And we didn't have a good solution for it last we discussed it. It was something that was desirable, but we couldn't think of an immediate solution for backwards compatibility, which is why we just left it out from this RFC.
I would suggest too, if we are going to push forward with an RFC on this, is like trying to spell out some of the future benefits of this so that it's more palatable to want to go and make these changes. You know, the things like Emily was talking about, like this makes the develop experience easier, or like some of the things you were talking about that like kind of come from once this change is made, then we can do these other changes, just so people can see that. Because I just worry, like Emily was saying, people will see the work and then not understand where we're going with it all.
Yeah. Also, to give you some context, like I barely have any time to work on this RFC anymore. My main focus, at least from the build packs perspective right now, is just like the security and integrity and cosine parts of it. So like if I have time right now, I'm mostly going to be working on that. This is an issue that we have to solve. We currently have hacks to solve this, and I would like a proper way for it. But like I within this next quarter, at least, I have very little time to work on this.
And so I understand you're going for, I mean, slimmer, more secure, without having to write an additional build pack to remove, you know, sensitive files, unnecessary files that have already been compiled for, you know, compiled applications. That kind of work seems burdensome. Whereas if it by default forces you to indicate what you want in the output image, then, you know, you're in control from the start. The problem is you already have a spec out there, and anyone using it is going to have to do that work to upgrade. Am I gathering this conversation correctly?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
The reason this came up in the Buildpacks General Slack channel yesterday was someone was trying to use this on Tecton, and I don't know the exact details, but it looks like Tecton mounts the original source code in one location, and then they were having to deal with the Buildpacks deleting everything. So they had to figure out some implementation which was copying the original source code to a separate volume and then providing that volume to the Buildpacks. I don't fully understand the context there because I don't use Tecton, or I don't know how or what you're doing that would require you to continuously have the source code. I'm guessing some sort of CI/CD pipeline where you start with a Tecton task that takes in your source repository, Buildpacks built it, and then you want to do something beyond that with the original source code, but there's no way to do that. And I'm guessing that's why they brought it up.
Isn't there some kind of comparable here with Docker multi-stage builds, right? So, you know, you have your first stage compilation, for example, and then your second stage more specific to what you need in that output image for, you know, running in a shared environment. And then that kind of seems to map to like a additional build pack needing to be like written, right? Which is kind of where we're at now. I don't know, am I off here? Or are you guys familiar with Docker multi-stage builds?
I understand the Docker multi-stage builds question. I see it a bit different from the Tecton question, because I guess like in a multi-stage build, you know, you put in your input, and like the first stage might make changes to it, and the second stage might make even more changes. But you haven't lost that your input exists. I guess this is the Tecton problem, where if everything's in the same pipeline, it's not just that your source was an input to the build pack part of this. It's like we've just destroyed it and you can't use it again later.
Yep.
I think if we were solving for just that problem, the solution I would want to do is something like what we have with slices, but like the anti-slice. Whereas right now you can sort of like have a glob that matches some fraction of the workspace, and then it becomes a separate layer, and you can use that to optimize performance. But if you had a glob that matched some fraction of the workspace, either by, you know, including or excluding, and then instead of just making it a separate layer, you're like, I'm just not going to include that, I think would be a way to get deleting behavior without deleting anything. But it doesn't solve for all the use cases that Sam was talking about. That would be like a specifically engineered for Tecton problem type solution.
I mean, their solution right now is to just copy this thing onto a separate volume and then use that for the Buildpacks task, and then just leave something, leave the original code for the other tasks.
But like maybe whiteout slices kind of gets at some of the other use cases, right? Like back end and front end use case. But it gets confusing because everyone's still making changes to the same directory.
Yep.
And then like the things that you're removing behind the scenes in a way that no one else can see what you've done.
Yep.
So just a thought.
There was another one of the use cases that we talked about, which again I didn't put in the RFC, was the whole sort of similar to your whiteout example. Like you're saying that I don't want this in my output image. The idea was, what if multiple workspaces mapped out to different environments? So you know how you have layers right now, which are like launch, build, cache? What if you had launch, prod, launch, test, and then similarly, like similar thing for application workspaces where like you're building multiple images, one for test, develop, and one for production, using one build. So like you run build and you get your build packs run, some of which produce production layers and production application workspaces, and some produce the dev plus test layers and test application workspace. So still very unclear, but like the way you mark launch equals to right now, you could mark like launch this extra image, like mark layers for like multiple output image types, and similarly map the application workspaces or slices to multiple output image types. So with a single build process, you end up with multiple images. One you can use for developing and testing, which has your test and dev dependencies, and then one which has your production dependencies. Which is like sort of what you can potentially achieve that using Docker multi-stage as well. Like you start with something, then you bifurcate your flows. One produces a dev image, installs dev dependencies, and then another target produces the prod image with prod dependencies. But it's a single Docker file that describes everything. So common steps are in a common place. And then you can add on more steps for your dev stuff or remove things for your prod stuff. But again, like this was such a huge, like, I don't know, like there were so many problems that we discussed when we were talking about this proposal. But
I worry that we're wasting some of our time on an academic exercise here if
Yep.
no one's going to take this forward anytime soon. Because, well, I find all these problems interesting, you know, looking at the list of things, if I was prioritizing, this would not be the top one.
same.
I wonder if as a project, just so we can get more done, we should be a bit more ruthless about saying what we're focusing on at any given moment versus what we're not.
I think this is also what I wanted to talk about in our team meeting, like just figuring out what we as a project want to achieve in 22, and so that we're not just like wasting our time on RFCs right now, which will not have an outcome in the near future. Like when the entire project is solving the dev test lifecycle, you'll have more hands and minds at the problem than like one person randomly trying to do this in their free time.
I think we should. I have some ideas around like, you know, more explicitly limiting the number of workflows we have going through by like having champions, and like once you can only champion one RFC. So like if you're championing one, then your bandwidth is sort of used up, and other things that no one is championing get put on hold. Some ideas like that. I'm not wedded to that particular one, but I want to find a way to sort of figure out what our bandwidth is and then just try to work on that number of things rather than like, I think we pay a lot of switching costs trying to, you know, run 7 threads in our one CPU or whatever the analogy is there.
Yeah. I think we should be more explicit about marking RFCs to a specific team. And you need at least one maintainer from that team to champion your RFC, that it will be implemented and actively worked upon. Otherwise, you just put the RFC on hold until you find a maintainer or a contributor who's aware of the changes, like someone who's doing the legwork.
I think we need to force people to
useful.
make trade-offs.
on
Like
how
people want to be able
that-
to say yes to everything, but I think you have to make it such that saying yes to one thing means saying no to another.
Yeah, like from my perspective, trying to stay up to date on like, oh, what are the changes that are going to be coming from upstream? You know, what changes are we going to need to make in Packet soon? You know, I'm like following GitHub issues for like RFCs that have been accepted, or just like every so often I check on RFCs, and it's yeah, sometimes it's really hard to tell, even from looking at the notes and PRs, like, do we need to implement support for this in Packet in like this quarter, or will this be superseded by an RFC that will merge first or something? It's a little hard to tell sometimes.
I think we as maintainers need to whip up all of our ongoing streams into shape. There's a lot of craft.
On that optimistic note, I gotta run to my next thing.
I do too. Thank you all. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
Same.
Take care.